Hello, everybody. Thank you for bearing with me. Last one up for a fairly long day, so I appreciate that. It's been an awesome conference so far. So, yeah, again, thanks for taking the time to come to my talk. So let's get it started. So in 2022, we could see the writing on the wall. The cloud infrastructure that we had designed just wasn't scaling to meet the business needs anymore. The story I want to share with you today is a universal one. It's actually less about our architecture or the infrastructure behind it as much as how change happens. How do we evolve our architecture? How do we get to that next step? What triggers change? Before we get started, we'll take a moment for some introductions. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the name Hashicorp. Okay, it's over there. It's not here. All right, there we go. Hashicorp, as you may or may not know, is a producer of a number of tools in the platform engineering space. Obviously, Terraform, Cloud, Console, Vault are some of the big names. HashiCloud Platform is about 3 years old, and it's the managed offering for all of those cloud service or all of those services. We provide those as managed offerings for companies to adopt. The HashiCloud Platform portion, being only 3 years old, is still really in the startup phase for HashiCorp. A little bit about me. So I've been at HashiCorp since December of 2022. Prior to HashiCorp, I worked at some big names like Netflix in the platform engineering space, and a number of years ago, I worked at Yahoo a while back. I've been part of and led some major initiatives at a bunch of these different places, including at Netflix was a move towards a managed delivery strategy for continuous delivery. And then at a large enterprise company, we did a fleet-wide migration from Heroku over to Azure, and then I'll talk a little bit more about my HashiCorp experience in this talk. Suffice it to say that I've been part of many major initiatives, I've led many major initiatives, and I've learned a lot about what contributes to success and what can cost you a lot. And so I hope to share some of those learnings with you all today. All right, let's get into the story. So in 2021, the HashiCloud platform infrastructure looked roughly like this. It was a standard control plane, data plane architecture. The control plane effectively provided a place, it's a typical infrastructure stack that provided a place for all of our backend services that were utilized to manage those data planes. It also supported an administrative UI that our customers would use for spinning up and managing those data planes as well. We had data planes, each of those data planes were customer specific, and so those would be where the managed instances of our console or our Vault services would be, and customers might have multiple data planes that they would leverage, and that's where most of the traffic was going to those data planes. At the time, come on, move forward, we were out of a single region in AWS, US East 1, but we could spin up data planes anywhere in the world that we needed to. So at this time, our world was very simple. I'm oversimplifying it a bit here, but it was very simple. It was effectively a mono repo where all of our infrastructure definitions and configuration lived. And yes, we did not have a single main TF file, but for all intents and purposes, it was fairly monolithic. But this worked fine for us. For the regional reasons we designed it, which was for managing of those data planes, this worked great. We were able to spin up and manage data planes, actually tens of thousands of data planes as a result of this. It was easy to reason about, it was easy to update, and for the most part, it just worked well for us. But, like probably has happened to many of you, over time, we got more and more asks from teams. We had different kinds of workloads that teams wanted to be able to put onto our control plane that was a little bit different from what our control plane was designed for. We had higher security workloads that couldn't really live in our control plane next to the other services, and so we needed to start to figure out how to manage those challenges as well. And so over time, we started to bolt on these asks and add into these things into our garden, and so our design went from something like this to something like this. In 2022, we could see the writing on the wall. The design was just not scaling. The original intentions that we had built for our control plane were just not scaling the way we wanted it to. And so we were starting to expand beyond our original infrastructure scope. Now I'm going to pause for a minute, and just by show of hands, how many of you have lived this experience or are living it right now in your companies, where your original architecture is stretching beyond what you intended to? Yeah, right? This is a common problem that we all face, and it's very challenging. And I suspect, like many of you, and folks from Hashicorp are all the way in the back also raised their hands. Thank you, guys. Like many of you, you probably did something like this. Let's change the engine while we're flying, right? We got to continue the business needs, and so let's figure out how we fit that evolution into our work stream. The problem is that ends up being more like this. You end up having lots of these different product asks and these other needs that come in, and so you're trying to juggle all of this work between what you need to do to enable the business, what the product lines are asking for, as well as what you might label as tech debt or operational excellence work. And it becomes very difficult to do anything besides moving relatively tactically on your changes, or it stretches out over a long period of time. And then it happened. The business came in and said, we need to stand up a second region in the US West. We dubbed this as Western Pioneer. That's the motif you see here. And we knew that this was going to be a precursor to also needing us to land 2 more regions in the European Union. And they wanted to do all of this within 12 months. So suddenly we were in a position of needing to actually replicate this 4 times. It's pretty scary. I don't know. I don't hear any gasps, but it was gasps in my organization when we heard this. Oh my gosh, 4 times. So you might be wondering, what did we do, right? If you weren't wondering that, that's the point of this talk. What did we do? So first thing, we knew that we couldn't replicate that garden of weeds. We needed to move to something new and something more manageable. And so we first needed to think about, how do we define our infrastructure platform in a new way that is more scalable? And to do that, we decomposed it. So the Tao of Hashi, which is our principles at Hashicorp, we call it the Tao, one of those is componentization or modularization. And while we had a degree of this before, we knew that we needed to lean into this a lot more. So we broke this apart into functional components, things that define the network layer, like the public ingress and the private ingress, things that defined the cluster and the stack definitions. So we broke it entirely apart and split out the repos into functional locations that could be managed. We also broke out the application or the configuration layer as well above the infrastructure configuration definitions. And so we broke this all apart. And the reason we did that is not just to make it easier for us to reason about and define, but we could recompose these into infrastructure use cases that we needed to support that were beyond just what a single control plane was designed for. So now we had a way of describing this new garden. We had a consistent set of components that we could reuse across the different environments that these components needed to support, because we had a development environment, an integration environment, and a production environment. And so we were able to now have a more reasonable and orderly system that we could then use to compose the infrastructure needs that we needed to support. The next step was we needed to figure out how to manage all of these, right? So we have all of these components, but up until this point, we hadn't really spent a ton of time trying to figure out how to solve the problem of efficiency, because we were only in a single region. We had scripts and we had tools and we had things that we worked on, but there wasn't a real compelling reason for us to lean heavily into automation until Western Pioneer made that a reality. We had to do that in order to survive managing 4 regions. So we leaned into automation, and from there, what we did is we looked at how do we automate the pre-deployment and the post-deployment steps of once the infrastructure spun up, the configuration that needs to happen after it's been landed to support the managed services that we needed to support in there. We looked at, we built end-to-end test tooling, and we built metadata tracking services. And all of these bits of automation in order for us to be able to manage a consistent consistency across all of these different regions and across all of the different environments we needed to support. None of this is revolutionary or exciting, I think, from the standpoint that I think everybody can agree that automation is usually a good strategy to go towards when you're trying to manage this kind of breadth. I think the point here, though, is that it was the Western pioneer that pushed us into really needing to do this because now we had a compelling reason that it needed to happen. Let me give you an example. Before Western Pioneer, and don't worry about reading all the text on here. I try to avoid big walls of text. So just notice there's a lot of red. That's all I really want you guys to see. So this was the upgrade workflow for when we would evolve one of our managed services. So we have like our Nomad cluster or our Vault cluster that we provide to internal engineering teams. And 4 of those red boxes indicate a validation step that would happen, and all the red is manual. So essentially a change would get rolled out into a static test environment that we had created that we reused over and over again, and then we would manually test the change that was made to see if it broke anything with our services. We would merge that, and then we would roll it out to our dev environment, do another manual test, roll it out to our int environment, do another test, and then roll it out to our prod environment and do another test. And so you can imagine this process took time, and it did. Even if it went smoothly, you're looking at about a week to a week and a half, potentially more. It took time to get this all rolled out and have that confidence. But when you only had a single region, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. You weren't doing this all the time. After Western Pioneer, we built a bunch of automation around this. So all the green is automation, and that yellow is also actually automation there in this case too. So now similar workflow, but when it rolls out, we actually spin up the full infrastructure stack. So it's an ephemeral stack that's basically spun up. We run a bunch of validation tests, and then we tear it down. And that's those yellow boxes there. That is done in the course of about 2 hours. And really the only reason why it takes that time is simply because of AWS API performance. But essentially that is a full ephemeral end-to-end testing environment. Then it rolls out to our dev, our int, and our production environment after being merged automatically. And one other bit I'll note, there's multiple greens happening there, and that's representing all of the different regions that we actually can support now. So this entire workflow can be done in the course of a few hours now. So before Western Pioneer, before this initiative, we were in a single region. We had a monolithic configuration. We were blending a lot of concerns, and versioning and upgrading of these components was taking weeks. After Western Pioneer, we're in multiple regions, we've componentized configuration, we've separated these concerns, and now upgrades take hours. But I want to highlight another thing. Doing all of that work, the decomposition and the automation, put us into a different spot for innovation now. Because now we can look at real exciting opportunities like true ephemeral infrastructure for development environments and lots of other use cases. We can look at blue-green strategies for full infrastructure deployment and rollout and changes. This is a step function level improvement from where we were before. The best part is we had 12 months to achieve this, and we hit our major goals in 10 months. So why did this work? Right? So that's all great. We did all this interesting work on our platform. We improved our capabilities. What was different? Why did this happen in 10 months and we had been spending a long time prior to that trying to get even close to some of these improvements? The first key one here, and this is no surprise, I'm sure, to anybody, but we had a clear objective. And I want to discuss what that means for a second. A clear objective isn't just, I understand at a high level what we're trying to get to. It's that your engineers understand what success criteria is. They understand what they're trying to achieve and how they're being measured. And that makes all the difference in them being able to focus on the right work as opposed to needing to bring on more people to solve this problem. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Radical Focus about this topic. I'll illustrate this a little bit. I mentioned about the juggler experience. Well, the juggler experience is what we were living. We were trying to go after a lot of different targets. There was a lot of things we wanted to try to achieve at the same time. We had that operational excellence, and we had the tech debt burned down, and we had some of these other requirements that we needed to reach for enabling other aspects of the business, and we had other priorities coming in, and we had a mix of different areas that we wanted to try to improve in the platform. So we were shooting all over the place. And so it was very difficult for us to focus our energy. Western Pioneer helped us with this. It gave us clarity about what it is that we needed to land, what it is that we needed to achieve. There was a deadline. Now, this is one I cannot emphasize enough as to how important it is. A deadline, and I love this quote from Adam Savage. Hopefully many of you remember the Mythbusters. What I like about this quote is Adam Savage is not talking about software engineering, but the same principle applies. We go into exotic materials and processes when we have lots of time or when we have unbounded time. And that's where the problems start to come about. Deadlines give us accountability, and they can create a sense of urgency. John Kotter talks about this in Leading Change. It's one of the most important things when you're trying to make a big impact on a business is having a sense of urgency that helps drive the rest of the organization towards an outcome. And let me illustrate this a little bit further. When you have a project that's set up that can land for 3 months or 6 months, as you're executing, I promise you engineering teams will come up with new ideas. They will identify new opportunities. And this can be good, but what that can end up doing is also bloating scope. And you can start to boil the ocean with this solution. And that often happens when you don't have a target that you're trying to deliver by. Picking a target forces a few things. It forces accountability, and it forces the right trade-off conversations to happen. I'm sure everybody's been in these situations where you have 3 months left to finally deliver on the thing that you're trying to deliver on, and you have to make really tough choices. I've lived this experience multiple times where there has been no deadline for delivery and where there has been a deadline for delivery. And I promise every single time the deadline is the thing that actually got us over the finish line and actually resulted in that becoming a thing that the business can benefit from. Picking the deadlines helps drive and focus people and keeps those exotic materials out. The last one, and this has been brought up a bunch of times today, actually. I've noticed in a lot of talks, and I want to emphasize this from a kind of a bit of a different perspective. Western Pioneer was not an initiative that was born out of our organization as something we needed to do. This was a business priority that came in. And the reason why that's important, and I heard this in earlier talks as well about executive buy-in. Again, John Kotter, if you haven't read this book, Leading Change, it's not the book I'm going to suggest. But if you haven't read this book, it's a fantastic book. Another great book is How Big Things Are Done. I think that's the name. Is another great book. Long story short, John Kotter points this out. Unless the head of an organization is an active supporter, major change is impossible. I've lived this one too, and I can tell you some bloody stories about this one. But long story short, you need executive sponsorship. You need that upper leadership buy-in in order to create the cover that you need. And I'm going to illustrate why this is. Going back to that juggler, whenever you have a major project, let's say, and I'll just ask you all to kind of imagine a major project that you're working on, that you're executing. During the course of that project, there was no doubt new asks that came in from other teams. And pushing back against those asks can be really challenging. And what's even more challenging is when you actually need to make asks of them. And great examples of this are when you're asking them to migrate from one system to another. You need them to change the API that they're interacting with, or some other movement that you need from them to make. These are extremely hard to move forward. Executive buy-in gives you that powerful ally that enables you, it creates that cover that you need to be able to say no to some of the asks. It creates the space your engineering teams need to be able to execute. And more importantly, it helps you hold the other teams accountable to the delivery and to the timelines that they have committed to for those projects to get done. So another question you might be asking in your head is, how do you get executive buy-in, right? It's a hard question to answer. And the short answer I will give you today is, and I'm happy to go into this in more detail, You need to spend time getting to understand what the strategy of the business is and getting to know the executives. You need to ask them what keeps them up at night. You need to understand what is their motivation, and then take a look at the projects that you have and understand how you can tailor the outcomes of those projects to help further their goals. If they identify your project as strategically aligned with their goals, they're far more inclined to then put your project as a top project that needs to get executed, and that's how you can bring them in as an ally. And there's a lot of detail behind that. I'm more than happy to answer more questions on that. Great. Okay, so it looks like I've got, is that total time left?
Yes.
Sweet. All right, I'm doing well. All right, so just to kind of wrap this up, so my organization, we learned a lot from this experience. And it really actually brought us closer together. We learned a lot about how to engage with other teams. We learned a lot about what it takes to be successful in these kinds of transformations. And so we're actually taking these lessons and applying them to the next step that we want to take for our infrastructure platform, which is to build a full self-service experience from soup to nuts for our engineering teams and internal customers. But hopefully I'll have a chance to tell you about that next time. All right. And by the way, that bottom left QR code is my LinkedIn. If anybody's interested, I'd be more than happy to connect and answer any questions that I don't get to today.
Cool. Thank you, Michael.
All right, cool. The QR code on the right is to ask questions in Slido. While we wait for the questions from you guys to come in, I will actually ask you one, Michael. Well, one thing I wanted to highlight is I really like the emphasis on the deadlines. And this, by the way, I'm an IC, I'm a software engineer, and I'm saying this, so like you know that I do stand by it, even though it seems hard to believe. I've seen the cultures where they do seem like they don't want to do the deadlines, even from leadership too. You know, leadership saying like, oh, we don't want to give you guys deadlines, we don't want you to feel pressure. But at the same time, I do see the downsides a lot of the time that you mention. So I'm curious, if we do add in those deadlines, how do you avoid that pressure aspect and potentially making engineers feel like they're maybe getting burnt out or something like that?
Well, there's an interesting phenomenon here. One, you cannot do these in a vacuum, right? You need to engage with your engineering staff. So engineering needs to be involved in both making sure that the objectives are clear, like they understand the success criteria is clear so that they're able to take action. But on the deadlines, they need to be involved in deciding what those deadlines are. But I think at that point, you're at a commit stage. Mm-hmm. You need to move forward. And the interesting thing you mentioned about burnout, I've actually found burnout doesn't happen because of deadlines. It happens because something goes on for too long and never arrives, right? There's a sense of completion when you hit a deadline and you launch something. And you can take that moment of pause. One thing I learned in my own experience as well is you don't want to go back into a long run mode either. People, there's an order and a feel of progression when you have meaningful deadlines that you deliver on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I 100% agree with the aspect of like having the engineer, the dates come from the engineers as well. I've found that to be really valuable. Cool. We got a bunch of questions that came in. Feel free to upvote the ones that you guys like. Let's start with the first one. Do you do failover from one region to another?
Yes. Well, mostly. We're almost there. There is a lot to do with failover, but we do have all of the infrastructure there. One of the principles we took, and I'll just quickly answer this, we started with the understanding, this is coming from my Netflix colleagues, so shout out to all of you guys, is a recognition that failovers should be boring and non-scary, and that means they need to be fully automated. So we leaned into the idea that we need to orchestrate automation all the way through. But yes, we do have the ability to do, we're actually actively testing that now. So we do failover events once a month to test that skill and the capability.
Awesome. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is, how do you create space for creativity in this process?
So that's an interesting question. I think this comes down to understanding what setting a clear objective means. What I don't believe it means is defining the how. Setting a clear objective defines the what. It defines what the outcome needs to be. In other words, a capability or something that needs to be landed. But the creativity that really comes into that, I believe, is from the engineering side saying, okay, I have an idea about how we can solve that problem. So we said that that failover needed to be automated, but we didn't define what that meant, like in terms of, not what that meant, but how to do that, right? We just defined criteria like it needed to be within a certain time period that the failover needs to occur. It shouldn't require human steps once it's been kicked off. There should be a single master switch. So in short, define the what, make sure the why is ultra clear, but let engineering own the how. That's what you hired them for. That's what they're there for.
It's a really great point. All right, let's go to the next one. We have you encountered teams consistently missing their own deadlines? How do you handle that? It's a great question.
So this is an interesting question. So this goes back to a conversation around predictability. I was having this with some of my peers during this conference actually here. I believe firmly in understanding and tracking what your teams are committing to and what they're delivering. Not for the point of punitive approaches or anything like that, but to get curious, to understand what is causing challenges with them being able to deliver on the timelines that they have set. Because often it's things that are not due to poor performance necessarily. It could be to lack of clarity about what needs to be achieved. It could be due to, again, choosing maybe exotic materials or in unclear scope. So when we encounter that, I guess the long story short is get curious. That's the right answer.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, we have time for maybe one or two more. Let's go to, do you run on multi-cloud? On which cloud does most of Hashicorp run?
Control plane runs on AWS. Most of our in-house infrastructure runs on AWS, but our data planes run on all three major CSPs. So AWS, I guess I have to specify that. Somebody mentioned Oracle Cloud, and I forgot about that. I shouldn't be mean. AWS, GCP, this is recorded, so now I'm going to get in trouble. AWS, GCP, and Azure.
Got it. I really like this one that came up. I want to dedicate some to this one. If you had to do it again, what would you do differently?
Oh, that's a good question. There's always lots of things I think I would explore. Generally, I think one area I'm kind of a little surprised, maybe it didn't come across during my presentation here. In order for us to get the space to do this, we had to say no to a lot of things because this was a lot of work on our side. So you can imagine that getting that space with that executive sponsor can create some challenges with the rest of the organization because there's other parts of the organization that are having to necessarily wait on things while we're delivering on these strategic outcomes for the business. I think if we were to do it differently or do it over again, I think one thing I would have liked to have done is have at least captured what better looks like for those teams so that we could set better expectations for them in the future on when some of the asks that they had would land. I think that was one area that we may have missed, honestly.
That makes sense. Cool. I think, we have time for our last question, which I've been doing to all speakers. You're the last one of the day. Congratulations.
Yeah.
So looking forward to this book recommendation. What is one book that you would recommend to the audience that has changed the way you work or how you go about your life?
So there's several books here. Can I give several? Is that all right?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, but I'm going to count the first one that you give.
Well, the latest book that I've been reading and really, really enjoying is Culture Map. It's a book that, if you haven't read it, discusses a lot about the different ways that different cultures basically work together, collaborate, understand how to prioritize, make decisions. It's been fascinating for me because I've realized how many times I've just done that entirely wrong.
I love those types of books where you just realize, oh, geez, I had that situation the other day. I could have done that thing.
Yeah.
And
It's every day I wake up.
Yeah. Wait, so you only want to give one? I thought you wanted
Oh
to give
yeah,
more.
so the other one I was going to mention, it's a classic one, and I'm sure many of you have heard it, but honestly, every single time I read it, I have that same feeling, which is how to win friends and influence people.
Yeah.
And I know all of you might say, oh, I've read that, and I would strongly suggest if you have, it's great to pick up again, because 90% of what leads to success in the organizations that we're working in is our ability to figure out how to connect effectively with those that we need to be able to influence and to move and align and get things done together. And that book just has some classic tactical strategies, not the least of which is smile more often.
Yeah. What a way to end the day. Thank you so much, Michael. Let's give it up for Michael, everyone.
Thank you.